The sun hung low over the horizon, drenching the neighborhood in a golden glow. It was the kind of community that seemed picturesque at first glance. Rows of pristine houses with perfectly manicured lawns, SUVs parked in spotless driveways, and a glossy HOA sign at the entrance, reminding everyone that order must be maintained. I pulled my truck up to my house at the far end of the cul-de-sac, kicking up a little dust as I rolled in. The other homes had been built only a few years ago, but mine? It had been here long before this HOA ever existed. It was my grandfather's land before it was mine. And more importantly, it was the only property with direct access to the main road leading into the neighborhood. I stepped out, my boots hitting the pavement with a familiar thud. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and barbecues from neighbors I'd never spoken to. Most of them saw me as an outsider, despite the fact that I'd lived here longer than any of them. They didn't like that my house wasn't a cookie-cutter replica of theirs. They didn't like that I parked my truck in my own driveway, instead of tucking it away like some kind of secret shame. And they really didn't like that I had never officially joined the HOA. I didn't need to. My house was on private land, separate from the association's jurisdiction. But that never stopped them from trying to control me anyway. I spotted Diane Reynolds, the HOA president, standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard, watching me with thinly veiled disdain. She was the self-appointed queen of this neighborhood, and she wielded her authority like a badge of honor. "You're late on your lawn maintenance again, Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice dripping with fake politeness. I looked at my lawn. Sure, it was a little wild, but nothing outrageous. It wasn't like I had rusty appliances sitting in my yard. I forced a smile. "Appreciate the concern, Diane, but I'm not part of the HOA, remember?" She pursed her lips, as if she had just bitten into something sour. "Well, the board has received multiple complaints. This neighborhood has a standard to uphold." I exhaled slowly, keeping my temper in check. "This land has been in my family for generations. I take care of it just fine." Diane tapped her clipboard, her nails clicking against it like a metronome of passive aggression. "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Carter. I'd hate for this to become an ongoing issue." With that, she spun on her heel and strode away, her expensive heels clicking against the pavement. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the familiar frustration settle in. It wasn't just the lawn. It was the notes left on my door about my acceptable paint colors. It was the passive-aggressive warnings about my truck being unsightly. It was the way my property, my home, was treated like an eyesore in a place where I should have been the one calling the shots. I wasn't against a nice neighborhood. I wasn't against people wanting a certain look for their homes. But I was against being told what to do on land that wasn't theirs to control. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Diane Reynolds wasn't just an HOA president. She was the HOA president. The kind of person who wore her title like a crown and ruled over the neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. She wasn't an elected leader as much as she was an inevitable one. No one had dared run against her, mostly because they knew she wouldn't lose. Not because she was popular, far from it, but because she had a way of getting what she wanted. She was in her mid-50s, always dressed in impeccably coordinated outfits, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement like a metronome of control. Her blonde bob was always flawless, never a strand out of place. And her clipboard? Always in hand, filled with violations, complaints, and passive-aggressive suggestions for how the neighborhood could improve. And she had set her sights on me. Diane believed that every inch of this community needed to fit her vision of suburban perfection, and my house, the only one that wasn't under her direct rule, was a blemish on her otherwise spotless record. She had tried everything: veiled threats, fake kindness, even offering to help me join the HOA for my own benefit. But when none of that worked, she switched tactics. And that's when the real trouble started. It started small. A notice taped to my door about community aesthetics. Then another one about non-compliant vehicle parking. Then a third, saying my lawn wasn't in line with neighborhood expectations. At first, I ignored them. After all, I wasn't part of the HOA. Then, one day, I came home to something new. A bright red sticker, slapped onto the windshield of my truck. Violation. Unauthorized parking. I ripped it off, my jaw tightening. I wasn't parked on the street. I wasn't blocking anyone's driveway. I was in my own damn driveway. That's when I saw her. Diane stood across the street, clipboard in hand, her arms crossed like she was waiting for me to thank her for the warning. I strode over, holding up the sticker. What the hell is this? She gave me a tight-lipped smile. A formal notice. We have rules about commercial vehicles and driveways, and... This isn't a commercial vehicle, I interrupted. It's my personal truck. Diane barely blinked. It's large, unsightly, and disrupts the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. We have rules, Mr. Carter. I clenched my jaw. I'm not in the HOA. Diane's smile didn't falter. That doesn't mean you can ignore the standards we've set for the community. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. This is my property. You have no jurisdiction here. Diane tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharp. Oh, but we do. You live in this neighborhood. You use its roads, its sidewalks. You benefit from its appeal. It would be a shame if certain privileges were revoked. She didn't elaborate, but I knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't about a truck. It wasn't about my lawn. It was about control. And Diane Reynolds didn't like what she couldn't control. The notices kept coming. Then came the letters. Official-looking ones, stamped with the HOA seal. Then, one morning, I got something even better. A fine. A crisp envelope, slipped under my door. Amount due, $50,000. I stared at the number, my pulse pounding. $50,000. For consistent non-compliance with community standards. I let out a bitter laugh. They had really lost their minds. I marched right over to Diane's house, knocking hard enough to rattle her stupid wreath. She opened the door with a practiced look of polite surprise, like she hadn't been waiting for this moment. Mr. Carter, she said smoothly. What a surprise. I held up the letter. This has to be a joke. Diane clasped her hands together. I assure you, it's quite real. The HOA board has deemed your continued violations unacceptable. We have rules, and when rules are ignored, there are consequences. I took a step forward, lowering my voice. I'm not in the HOA. Diane didn't flinch. But you live within the neighborhood, and, as such, your property affects the overall aesthetic. If you refuse to comply, we have legal options. I narrow my eyes. Legal options? She smiled. We could place a lien on your home. It's standard procedure for unpaid fines. You'd be surprised how quickly these things can escalate. She said it so casually, like she was talking about the weather, like she wasn't threatening my home. I gritted my teeth, every instinct screaming at me to lash out. But I didn't. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I took a slow breath, straightened up, and smiled. A real, calm, collected smile. You know what, Diane? I said, you're absolutely right. Rules are important, and I think it's time we take a closer look at them. She frowned slightly. Excuse me. I folded the letter neatly, tucking it into my pocket. I'll be in touch. Then I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing there, clipboard clutched tight in her hands. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming next. I spent the evening on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. A cold drink rested in my hand, untouched. The weight of that $50,000 fine sat heavy in my chest, but not for the reasons Diane probably thought. Most people in this neighborhood saw me as just another homeowner, an outsider who didn't fit into their pristine world. They didn't know my history. They didn't know who I was. Or more importantly, what I owned. I pulled out an old folder from my grandfather's desk, flipping through the brittle, yellowed papers. Property deeds, land surveys, infrastructure contracts. I traced my finger over the faded ink, a slow smile creeping onto my face. These weren't just legal documents. These were the keys to the entire neighborhood. Because long before this HOA ever existed, before these identical houses were built, my family had owned every square inch of the land they now stood on. When the developers came in, they bought out most of the property, except for mine. And the best part? The only road leading into the neighborhood? It still belonged to me. Diane didn't know it yet, but she was about to find out. Escalating encounters, pushing the wrong man. The next morning, I found a tow truck parked in my driveway. A worker in a neon vest was slapping another violation sticker on my truck, while Diane stood off to the side, watching with a satisfied smirk. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice calm. You want to explain what's going on? Diane gestured to the tow truck. You were warned about the vehicle violations. Since you refused to comply, the board has voted to have it removed. I chuckled, shaking my head. You can't tow a vehicle off private property. Diane's smile didn't waver. We'll see what the county has to say about that. I took a step forward, locking eyes with the tow truck driver. You touch my truck, and you're trespassing. The guy hesitated, looking between me and Diane. I was just told to. I pulled out my phone, holding it up. Then I'd suggest you call your boss before you end up in a lawsuit. The driver hesitated for another second, then mumbled something under his breath and climbed back into the truck. Diane's smirk faltered. This kind of defiance isn't going to work out well for you, Mr. Carter. I crossed my arms. Diane, you're real good at making threats, but you don't seem to understand who you're dealing with. Her eyes narrowed slightly. We'll see about that. And with that, she turned and walked away. I watched her go, my fingers tapping idly against my phone. She was getting desperate, and desperate people, they always made mistakes. More pressure, more mistakes. 2 days later, I got a letter from the HOA's lawyers. They were officially filing to place a lien on my property. I laughed as I read it, shaking my head. Oh, Diane. Later that night, I took a walk through the neighborhood, hands in my pockets, taking in the streets, the sidewalks, the entrance gates. These people thought they owned this place. They had no idea that their entire world sat on my land. I glanced at the street sign at the entrance of the neighborhood. The little blue plaque that read, Private Road, Community Access Only. They really should have read the fine print. Cliffhanger, the calm before the storm. The next morning, I parked my truck in the exact same spot in my driveway, just to piss Diane off. Sure enough, not an hour later, she stormed up to my house, 2 board members trailing behind her like lackeys. Enough of this nonsense, she snapped, thrusting a new notice toward me. The board has unanimously voted to escalate your violations to legal action. I took the paper, barely glancing at it. That right. Her lips curled. We're done playing games, Mr. Carter. I smiled. Oh, Diane, you have no idea what game you just stepped into. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my back pocket. Well, I said casually, I think it's time I had a little meeting of my own. She frowned. What do you mean? I simply smiled, stepping back into my house and closing the door behind me. I could feel Diane's frustration through the wood. She thought she had me cornered. But what she didn't know was that I had already won. Moment of strength. The meeting that changes everything. The next morning, I took a slow drive downtown, my truck rumbling beneath me as I headed to the county records office. I had been here before. Years ago. Back when I first inherited the land from my grandfather. Back when I made sure that every legal detail was locked down so that no one, no matter how entitled or power-hungry, could ever take it from me. I stepped inside, greeted the clerk, and requested the documents I needed. The woman behind the desk gave me a curious glance when she saw the property files, but she said nothing as she slid the paperwork over. I flipped through them, smiling to myself. Everything was still exactly as I left it. Every road, every easement, every right-of-way agreement, all under my name. By the time I walked out of the records office, I had everything I needed. It was time to let Diane know exactly what she had been messing with. Resilience under pressure. Diane doubles down. I wasn't surprised when I got another letter the next day. Another fine. Another threat. Another attempt to bully me into submission. Diane must have thought I was breaking, that I was reaching my limit. I smiled as I read it, shaking my head. She really had no idea. That evening, I sat on my porch, watching as a few neighbors hesitantly walked by, shooting me cautious glances. They had heard about the fines, the legal threats. Diane had made sure of it. She wanted to turn the entire community against me, to isolate me, to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. I didn't budge, didn't waver. Instead, I did what I always did. I waited. Because timing was everything. Building audience expectation. The trap is set. The next day, I called the HOA's legal firm. The poor assistant on the other end stammered as I politely asked for a meeting with their lead attorney. May I ask what this is regarding, sir? I smiled. Just a simple matter of property rights. I think your client, Mrs. Reynolds, might be interested. Silence. Then a quiet, I'll get back to you shortly. I hung up, leaning back in my chair. Now I thought, let's see what Diane does next. The HOA meeting. A stage for the truth. The air inside the community center was thick with tension. The HOA board members sat in a neat row at the front of the room, their backs straight, eyes scanning the crowd with self-importance. Diane sat at the center, radiating smug authority. I stood at the back, arms crossed, waiting. The room was full, neighbors, homeowners, and even a few residents who rarely attended these meetings. Word had spread about my defiance, and people were curious to see how this all played out. Diane cleared her throat and tapped the microphone. Good evening, everyone. As you all know, we have a matter of non-compliance to address tonight. A murmur rippled through the room. Diane shot me a pointed look. Mr. Carter has refused to adhere to our regulations and has continued to accrue fines, all while challenging the authority of this association. She turned to the HOA's lawyer, a stiff-looking man in a navy suit. At this point, we are prepared to move forward with placing a lien on his property. The lawyer nodded. That is correct. We've already filed the necessary paperwork. Diane turned back to me, her smile widening. Mr. Carter, unless you have something of actual substance to contribute, I believe this matter is closed. I took a slow breath. This was the moment. I stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. I actually do have something to contribute. Diane's smirk faltered for half a second before she recovered. Oh, do you finally plan to pay your fines? I reached into my folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. No, but I do think you'll be interested in these. I walked up to the table and slid the papers toward the HOA's lawyer. Go ahead, I said. Take a look. The lawyer frowned, but started flipping through the documents. Then he froze. A long, heavy silence stretched over the room. Diane's confidence wavered. What is that? The lawyer swallowed hard and turned to her, his face pale. Diane, did you know about this? Know about what? She snapped. I folded my arms, watching as the truth dawned on them. That, I said, is the original deed to this land. The roads, the sidewalks, the main entrance, all of it is still legally owned by me. Gasps echoed through the room. Diane's smile finally vanished. That can't be right. The HOA owns the roads. No, Diane. I shook my head. You lease the roads from me. And guess what? I pulled out another document and laid it on the table. According to this contract, I have the legal authority to revoke public access at any time. The power shift, watching the queen fall. Diane's face drained a color. That's not possible. The lawyer rubbed his temples. It's all here, Diane. The road leading into the neighborhood is his private property. He turned to me. And you're saying you want to revoke access? I shrugged. I've been mistreated, fined, threatened with a lien. I don't see why I should let this neighborhood use my land for free anymore. Diane shot to her feet. You can't do that. That would cut off the entire community. Yeah, I said, feigning deep thought. It really would be a shame if emergency services, deliveries, and residents couldn't access their own homes. The room erupted into whispers. Neighbors looked at each other with wide eyes. Diane turned to the crowd, panic creeping into her voice. People, don't be fooled by this. He's lying. The HOA lawyer cut her off. Diane, stop. She whirled on him. Excuse me. The lawyer took a deep breath, looking exhausted. I just checked the county database. He's right. The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band. Diane staggered back a step, as if the weight of her mistake had physically hit her. I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough so that only she and the board could hear. I warned you, Diane. You thought you had power over me, but you never even knew who you were dealing with. I turned to the audience and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. Effective immediately, the only road leading into this neighborhood is now closed to HOA members unless a proper agreement is reached. The panic in Diane's eyes was unmistakable. You can't. Oh, I can, I said, cutting her off. And I will. A heavy silence fell over the room. Diane opened her mouth, but for the first time since I met her, she had nothing to say. Consequences for Diane. The HOA crumbles. The meeting ended in chaos. People rushed out, murmuring in hushed tones, their once blind allegiance to Diane now cracking under the weight of real consequences. And Diane? She was still standing in the front of the room, rigid, eyes darting between the HOA lawyer and the stunned board members. She looked small now. The woman who had held so much power, who had wielded it like a weapon, had just learned that she was, in the end, powerless. The HOA lawyer packed up his papers and sighed. Diane, we need to talk. Immediately. Diane flinched. I'm serious. The lawyer interrupted, his voice flat. This is a legal disaster. If Mr. Carter follows through on his decision to revoke access, Every homeowner in this neighborhood will be trapped. And he hesitated before finishing. They'll have grounds for a lawsuit. A wave of realization washed over Diane's face. She wasn't just losing control. She was about to lose everything. I watched as board members turned on her, whispering among themselves. The same people who had once stood by her side now looked at her with disappointment and anger. "We should have been made aware of this," one of them muttered. "She's been finding people for years, acting like she owns the place," another said. Diane's hands trembled as she tried to keep up her usual composed demeanor, but it was no use. The queen had just been dethroned, and the people weren't loyal to a fallen ruler. A quiet victory, reclaiming what's mine. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't a threat. It was an offer. They were desperate. The board wanted to negotiate, to discuss options, to come to a mutual agreement. Diane, however, was noticeably absent from the email chain. It didn't take long to find out why. By noon, I got a text from one of my neighbors, Dave, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. "You're not going to believe this, but Diane just resigned." I grinned. Of course she did. She had no choice. With the community turning against her, the board scrambling to fix her mess, and the HOA lawyer likely begging her to step down before a class action lawsuit crushed them all, she must have realized that staying in power was impossible. The woman who had tried to bully me, who had treated me like nothing more than an obstacle, was now the one being pushed out. And just like that, the neighborhood was free of a reign. Final reflection, lessons in power and patience. A week later, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee as I watched the sunrise. The road stretched out before me, my road. For years, I had let the HOA dictate the rules, never stepping in, never flexing the quiet authority I'd always held. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I should have spoken up sooner. But in the end, I didn't need to fight. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to stoop to Diane's level. Because the truth, power isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about who actually holds the keys. And this time, when Diane tried to slam the door on me, I was the one holding the lock.